Hi, and thanks for joining me for the lecture on Unit 9, Part 3, Imperialism and the Scramble for Africa. In general, imperialism is the seizure and control of a country or territory by a stronger country for the purpose of extracting resources. You can see from the map on this slide that almost all of Africa was being controlled by European imperialist nations by 1914. There's just this little bit right here, the white part, which was the one independent territory. Causes of imperialism are mostly, as I said, the seizure of resources, and the industrialization that happened in Europe in the 1800s led to the need for resources that African states might have had, things like oil and or rubber. And so at this point in time, European countries were scrambling or racing to claim African countries and territories to more or less control their vast resources and to enrich in the European states. Another cause of imperialism at this point in time was a belief in European superiority and nationalism. There's just a kind of general racism, goes way back into the past, but it has a kind of renewed emphasis in the late 1800s. White people in Europe and in North America considered themselves to be more civilized than non-white people, and so they wanted to go out and, let's say, conquer them and quote-unquote civilize them and make them more European. Another thing that was going on at this point in time is a perversion of Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution, and this is called social Darwinism. And it's the idea that people who enjoyed wealth or success and had advanced technologies were superior over others and were more fit to be to survive in the race or competition between different kinds of humans. In fact, they started to look at different races of people as different species of human beings. This racism, this social Darwinism, justified European imperialism, and the people of Europe and people in North America felt like they had the burden or the duty to civilize, quote-unquote civilize people, in other words, make people live like the Europeans or live like the Americans around the world. Part of that was the idea that they needed to spread Christianity, but it's really much more about, quote-unquote, civilizing the Africans. And this belief is called white man's burden, that it's the burden of white people to go around the world and civilize non-white people. The Europeans were able to do this because they had technological superiority, especially when it came to weapons. You can see that image of the Maxim machine gun. They had rifles that fired much faster than the old muskets that they had from 100 years before. And of course the machine gun, which is invented around this point in time, smaller cannon and things like that, made it pretty easy for Europeans to go to Africa and defeat people who had much more primitive weapons. If they had some kind of firearm, then they were generally those firearms that were really quite a bit older, the ones that maybe were gotten from the slave trade in 150 years before this period of time. Another advantage or another thing that allowed Europeans at this point in time to invade and take over Africa was the development of new medicines that could fight tropical diseases. One example of that would be malaria. Malaria is a mosquito-borne disease that Europeans were not immune to, and it killed Europeans who moved to the tropics oftentimes. They came up with new medicines that overcame that particular problem, and then Europeans could live there year-round. Another European advantage was that Africa was not united, that there were many different rival ethnic groups, and they fought one another regularly, or they couldn't come together to try to fight against the Europeans and not be taken over by them. In Africa, there generally was European control, which was direct in nature. The Europeans looked at African governments and African civilizations and didn't really consider them to be civilized, and so they didn't allow most African people any kind of self-rule. They wanted African people to be more or less directly controlled by Europeans, and they wanted African people to assimilate or to become more like Europeans. And so, of course, they taught them European languages and sent the African elite to schools that had the European culture or whatever culture was taking over that particular territory, and taught them to dress like a European and act like a European, I guess, in order to give them a European-style government and European-style civilization. Some places in Africa and also places in Asia, like India, had a more indirect control by the Europeans, where they allowed some of the existing rulers to govern, oftentimes at lower levels, and tried to develop some of the African people or Asian people as future leaders, but always keeping control by the Europeans at the very top. The scramble for Africa, or the race for Africa, really begins in the 1880s. In the late 1870s, a king of Belgium, Leopold, decided to make a bunch of treaties with African people in the middle of Africa, in Congo, and decided to claim that territory. And other European states wondered if, Leopold was allowed to do that, or what the rules would be surrounding the seizure of African territory. And so in 1884 and in 1885, Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, you can see him holding that knife there, and everybody, and him carving up the African cake. He called 14 European nations to meet in Berlin at a conference to discuss and lay down the rules for dividing Africa. And what these European states decided was that any country in Europe could claim land in Africa simply by notifying other nations of its territorial claims, and then showing that it could control that area in some way. Of course, the Europeans didn't really pay attention to what the Africans wanted, or even pay attention to traditional or logical boundaries in any way, shape, or form. It was all about what the Europeans wanted. And of course, there were no African leaders present to say that these European states couldn't do that. And so, very quickly, within about 30 years or so, there were only 2 places in all of Africa that were still free of European control. One was a territory called Liberia, which had some freed American slaves who went there to live during the 19th century, 1800s, and the other was Ethiopia. Ethiopia is an interesting case in African resistance. Pretty much every single African people who tried to fight against European control or tried to free themselves from European control were defeated. The one exception to that is Ethiopia, and Ethiopia was a state which was run by an emperor, Menelik II, and he was a very skilled leader, and he had purchased a number of weapons, the same kinds of weapons that the Europeans were using, in other words, the same kinds of rifles and same kinds of machine guns. He had built up an army with these modern weapons. He had also modernized Ethiopia with a railroad system, and when the Italians came in and tried to take over Ethiopia, Menelik II was able to lead his people to defeat the Italian imperialists at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Another interesting case of attempted imperialist control, and it's a little bit unusual though, or a little bit different, is the so-called Boer War of 1899 to really about 1901. The Boers were Dutch settlers who had come to Africa starting in the 1600s, and they had colonized the southern part of Africa, in fact, what is today South Africa, and they had one territory away from the native tribes like the Zulus and others. Around 1815 or so, the British showed up in South Africa, and the Boers first moved away from these English-speaking British people, but they moved on to some land that they discovered gold and diamonds in, and the British came and wanted also to take the gold and diamonds from these Boer people, these white settlers, and the British eventually fought a war against the Boers, and in the end they were able to control the diamond and gold resources that the Boers had. So for the most part, the effects of imperialism are negative on Africa, but there are some small positive benefits to the Europeans coming in and taking over most of Africa. One is simply less local warfare as the Europeans come in, take over, and more or less prohibit local people from fighting against each other. There are some technological advancements, some improved sanitation, European-style education systems, and European-style, modern for that period of time, medical care. There's also some economic growth. However, for the most part, the benefit of the economic growth goes to the Europeans, who really, as I said, are just there to seize resources and profit from them. There are many more negative effects of imperialism. You can imagine that the people of Africa didn't want to lose their independence. They didn't want to lose their land. They didn't want to be controlled by foreigners. They start to gain nationalism as well, a love for people like themselves, and a kind of a dislike or hatred for people who are trying to control them. There's also widespread death due to the Europeans coming in and fighting the local people. Sometimes those wars ended up disrupting the local agriculture, and so famine broke out. There are some European diseases that maybe some of the Africans hadn't been exposed to, and they died from those diseases. And just in general, there are plenty of instances of large numbers of Africans being killed by Europeans when the Africans resisted European control. There's also a breakdown of traditional cultures as the Europeans tried to impose their cultures on African people and make the Africans assimilate into European culture. And then, of course, there's a political division of Africa as well, which did not take into consideration at all what the Africans wanted, or what kind of people, what languages the people in different parts of Africa spoke. It was really all about the Europeans just seizing whatever they wanted for their own purposes. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope that you learned something from it. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. Thanks. Bye-bye.